Eventually, although it doesn't always happen in exactly the same way, the deceased then pass through a dark tunnel with a light at the end. Upon emerging, they are usually greeted by loved ones in joyous reunion, and shortly afterward, sometimes immediately, have an even more remarkable encounter with a divine personage, often identified as a being of light. This being of light is considered by many of those who meet him to be Jesus Christ himself, and usually asks various questions, never in a harsh or judgmental manner, but rather in a spirit of kind and loving inquiry. For example, how did you spend your time in mortality? What did you learn? Many people also tell of undergoing a kind of instantaneous life review in which the events of their existence are even reenacted somewhat, as though one were seeing a video. In the life review, however, the individual involved is actually able to feel the impact of his words and actions upon others, for good or for evil. If he is dealt harshly or cruelly with someone, he can feel the sorrow and suffering. The reverse, of course, is true if he has treated them with love and with kindness. That marvelous review not only generates empathy, but also a heightened sense of responsibility. The sometimes painful yet healthy realization that I am accountable for my acts, that the buck stops here. Fortunately, the sense of responsibility persists once the spirit has returned to the body. Almost invariably, however, the return is highly reluctant. The new spirit realm and the associations are simply so good, so fulfilling, that the person who has arrived there is loath to depart. One man even became highly vexed at a doctor colleague who brought him back to mortality through electroshock, and upon having to re-enter his body exclaimed, "Carl, don't you ever do a thing like that again." In many instances, the dear departed appear to have no choice in the matter, and are at the command of those working upon their bodies, as though the connective strands between mortality and the next dimension haven't been fully severed. Sometimes, on the other hand, it becomes a definite personal decision, as in the case, for example, of the mother who has left young children behind and feels the need to be with them. In some instances, those who have left their bodies for longer periods report having fairly extended visits with their beloved family members who have gone beyond, quite often in delightful pastoral surroundings, lovely meadows and woodlands, much, it would seem, like those scenes described in the writings of J.R. Tolkien. In rarer instances, the person who has just died doesn't pass through a tunnel at all, but finds himself hurtling off into the heavens in the twinkling of an eye, as it were. Many, in fact, report having moved from one place to another, wherever they may be situated on the other side, with that same kind of rapidity, perhaps the speed of light. That alone would probably be so fascinating and downright exhilarating that one might never want to return to the comparatively slow, ponderous existence of mortality. Whatever the precise experience on the other side, those who return have acquired a new lease on life in more ways than one. Even though they have returned reluctantly, once they have adjusted to earthly living, they approach it with great enthusiasm. They now see life in much broader context and are able to extract the gold from the dross more discerningly, the consequential from the trivial. They seem to be at peace with themselves and with others, yet also highly enthusiastic, eager to make the most of whatever time remains. As people who no longer fear death, they are better able to embrace life. Invariably, according to Dr. Moody, that holds true for everyone, including the 1,000-plus people he has interviewed. In my 20 years of intense exposure to NDEers, he states, I have yet to find one who hasn't had a very deep and positive transformation as a result of this experience. Relatedly, all emerge from their sojourn in the next realm with the conviction that loving and learning are the two greatest elements of life. Indeed, love and learning combine to foster all the remaining great and godly virtues, such as faith, humility, generosity, courage, compassion, and so on. These NDEers now find the process of living a purposeful life far simpler. Unlike many other traumatic experiences, such as terrible accidents and disastrous losses, victimization and abuse, and so on, which leave most people emotionally devastated, the NDE almost always liberates and strengthens. This is true in many cases, even for suicides and criminals. The former return convinced that life has a purpose and that suicide is essentially simply a premature change of address. The latter see as never before the folly of their ways and resolve to reform. Once NDEers have returned and readjusted to earthly living, they seem eager to live out their remaining time on earth, not because they fear death, for that fear has been vanquished, but rather because they now realize that the life here is a highly significant phase of the whole eternal scheme, and that it should be experienced to the full. As Moody explains, NDEers return with a sense that everything is connected. This is difficult for them to define, but it is a newfound respect for nature and the world around them. He then illustrates with this moving comment from an NDEer who had suffered cardiac arrest at age 62. The first thing I saw when I awoke in the hospital was a flower, and I cried. Believe it or not, I had never really seen a flower until I came back from death. One big thing I learned when I died was that we are all a part of one big divine universe. If we think we can hurt another person or another living thing without hurting ourselves, we are sadly mistaken. I look at a forest or a flower or a bird now and say, that is me, part of me. We are connected with all things, and if we send love along those connections, then we are happy. Despite the ever-expanding evidence supporting the reality of near-death experiences, however, there are still plenty of skeptics who try to explain them on some other basis. Indeed, there are some in the medical profession, for example, who maintain that they have never encountered such things. Moody illustrates here by telling of a meeting he attended in which a doctor stood up and stated that during all his years of practice, he had never met anyone who claimed to have had an NDE. Immediately after he sat down, however, someone else stood up and said, "Doctor, I am one of them, and I am also one of your patients. But you are the last one I would ever share such an experience with." It is entirely possible, in other words, that those professionals who haven't heard of such things have either never inquired or have the kind of negative attitude that would turn NDEers off, make them feel as though they were casting their pearls before swine. Some people attempt to explain away such experiences by labeling them vivid dreams, delirium, hallucinations, and so forth. This despite the fact that there is usually no evidence whatever of brain activity or other signs of life in the individual claiming the NDE, as we have said. In addition, Dr. Moody and other experts who have taken the trouble to interview NDEers and carefully analyze their accounts insist that what happened simply cannot be explained away. In answers to those who maintain that the NDE is simply a form of mental illness, Moody replies that there is no more resemblance between the two than there is between a lamb and a lion. He then contrasts such mental disturbances as schizophrenia and organic brain problems like delirium with the NDE, demonstrating highly significant differences. Schizophrenia, for example, usually involves the hearing of strange voices, bizarre mannerisms, and loose, meaningless words and phrases called neologisms, along with worsening apathy. Right away, he says, you can see the difference between this terrible mental illness and the generally uplifting near-death experience. He then adds that although NDEers often hear words during their otherworldly experience, they are coherent and meaningful, uplifting, rather than psychologically destructive. As Moody also notes, although NDEers often claim to have encountered a being of light, they do not come away from the experience supposing that they are Napoleon or God because of it. Other attempts to explain away the NDE include the contention that it is simply a reenactment of the birth experience, a result of carbon dioxide overload, the mind's final instinctive efforts to deny that death is the end, or the manifestation of the so-called collective unconscious. None of these explanations holds up, however, under careful examination. All efforts to explain near-death experiences away, in fact, inevitably run into the same big problem. None have an answer for the remarkable ability of many NDEers to observe and report things occurring in connection with their own bodies once there is no longer any clinical evidence of life. How is it that patients can give such elaborate and detailed accounts of resuscitations? Moody inquires, explaining in their entirety what the doctors were doing to bring them back to life. How can so many people explain what was going on in other rooms of the hospital while their bodies were in the operating room being resuscitated? Moody cites in this regard the case of a man who had suffered such a severe heart attack that after 35 minutes of vigorous resuscitation, the doctor gave up and began filling out the death certificate. Then someone noticed faint signs of life, so the doctor resumed his efforts and finally managed to restart the patient's heart. The next day, that same patient described in detail what had transpired in the emergency room during the time he was gone from his body. He even described the emergency room nurse, right down to her wedge hairdo, and her last name, Hawks, along with the kind of resuscitation equipment that she was transporting to his room. Journeying down the hospital hallway to find his wife, he, quote, passed right through Nurse Hawks. He read the name tag as he went through her and remembered it so he could thank her later, unquote. All this to the utter amazement of the doctor, who, Moody adds, was quite rattled by it all. In another case, again to the astonishment of all involved, a woman of 70, blind since age 18, gave a vivid account of what the resuscitation instruments looked like, including the colors. Most of those instruments, in fact, had not even been thought of 50 years earlier when she could see. In still another case, a man and his sister were both critically ill simultaneously in different wards of the same hospital. The man with heart failure, the woman in a diabetic coma. Both died and passed into the spirit world at approximately the same time. After a brief visit together there, the man returned to this life, leaving his sister in the spirit world. Upon re-entering his body, he informed the doctor that his sister was now dead on the other side. Skeptical doctor denied such a possibility, but checked with the other ward and was nonplussed upon hearing the truth. Moody refers in The Light Beyond to other prominent doctors, psychiatrists and philosophers who support his conclusions, some of whom undertook studies of the near-death experience after reading his works on the subject. Ritchie, like Moody, is an MD and psychiatrist. His story begins during World War II when he was afflicted with a devastating case of pneumonia as a callow and materially minded recruit at Camp Barkley in Texas. It describes in fascinating detail his flight from his body homeward and return halfway there for an encounter with a magnificent being announced as the Son of God himself. It details at length his tour of the spirit realms with that same personage. At one point he encounters beings who have been so enslaved to negative thinking and destructive habits on earth that they are unable to escape them in the next life. Not, he stresses, that the Savior had abandoned them, but rather that they had abandoned him, creating their own unique kind of hell. He describes as well vast institutions of learning containing the great works of the universe, where spirits of the deceased are happily engrossed in an eternity of learning. Ironically, however, they have become so absorbed in books per se that they fail to discern the greater light, the mighty truth himself, standing there in the very midst of them. He also tells of a glorious city of light, glowing in the immense distances, wondrous and enthralling, but beyond his present reach. Like many others, Ritchie was asked what he had learned and done with his life, not, as he explains, because the Son of God was seeking information, for his entire life was there in plain sight, implicit, he says, in every scene. Furthermore, it seemed to be a question, in Ritchie's view, that was more about values than facts. Desperately, he began to search his mind for something that might reflect well, but could only recall a, quote, endless, short-sighted, clamorous concern for myself, unquote. Even his most prized achievement, that of becoming an Eagle Scout, he now realized had been largely an ego trip. His aspirations to become a medical doctor with the avowed intention of serving others, he also realized had been largely motivated by a desire for material belongings, a Cadillac, private plane, and so on. For a time he sought to excuse himself on grounds that he simply hadn't lived long enough to learn and do what was right, only to be lovingly reminded that death can arrive at any age. Momentarily, Ritchie thought about the insurance policy he had taken out previously, not so much with the idea that his beneficiaries might collect upon it, as with the subconscious conviction, quote, that this piece of paper might somehow guarantee life itself, unquote. Simultaneously, he began to realize that the presence beside him was emanating a sense of mirth, quote, that he seemed to vibrate and shimmer with a kind of holy laughter, not at me and my silliness, not a mocking laughter, but a mirth that seemed to say that in spite of all error and tragedy, joy was more lasting still, unquote. Above all, throughout the entire experience, the feeling and importance of love seemed to predominate. How much, Ritchie wondered, had he really loved? Have you loved others as I am loving you? The words came. Totally? Unconditionally? Realizing how far he fell short, Ritchie groped for some excuse, indignantly demanding that if love was, quote, the point of everything, why hadn't someone told me, unquote. Again, he felt that hint of heavenly laughter, free of all rebuke, merely great warmth and understanding, along with the following reply. I did tell you. I told you by the life I lived. I told you by the death I died. And if you keep your eyes on me, you will see more. Following his return, Ritchie astounded his medical doctors, including the hospital's commanding officer, Dr. Donald G. Francie, who termed his recovery, quote, the most amazing medical case I have ever encountered. In a notarized statement a year later, in fact, he wrote, Private George S. Ritchie's virtual call from death and return to vigorous health has to be explained in terms other than natural means, unquote. Like nearly all NDEers, Ritchie found that his life had undergone dramatic reorientation. Nevertheless, the years ahead were not easy. Arriving late for his entry into medical school and still recuperating from his illness, he found it impossible to catch up and study in the long hours required. In consequence, he was expelled from school and reclassified for active duty as a medic overseas. This proved to be the unhappiest experience of his life, and for a time he wondered bitterly why he had ever undergone his marvelous experience in the spirit realm. In time, however, he became inspired by the great love and spirit of Christ-like sacrifice manifest in some of his own comrades. Consequently, he began to see the Savior in the eyes of those around him who were giving their all to save the lives of others. From that time forward, his own life began to improve. Eventually, despite his earlier failure, he went on to become a doctor. He also lectured widely on his experiences in the spirit world, spreading, quote, the message that God is love and that all else is hell, unquote. George F. Ritchie continued to advance his message about the reality of a life to come and of Jesus Christ, despite a conviction that many people would brand him a religious fanatic and that such pursuits might ruin him professionally. When in fact he applied for his residency in psychiatry at the University of Virginia Hospital, a friend advised him not to mention his experiences in the next realm. The first question posed during his job interview, however, dealt with that very subject, and Ritchie turned to his Savior for help. Lord, what do I say now? He prayed. The reply came immediately and unequivocally. Deny me before men, and I will deny you before my Father. Those words, he reports, had been almost inaudible. But Ritchie responded to the question his interviewers asked frankly. A short time later, to his great delight and surprise, he was accepted unanimously by the examining staff. Years afterward, when he and the same interviewer had become close friends, Ritchie learned that everyone on the examining board had known of his claims about the other world. "If you had pretended with me even for one moment that it hadn't happened," he was informed, "I'd have put you down as a deeply insecure person and probably an emotionally disturbed one who couldn't distinguish between fact and fancy." Such, in brief, is the message of Dr. George A. Ritchie's popular Return from Tomorrow. It is a work, in my estimation, that should be read by everyone, and concludes with the following inspirational message. God is busy building a race of men who know how to love. I believe that the fate of the earth itself depends on the progress we make, and that the time is now very short. As for what we will find in the next world, here too I believe that what we'll discover there depends on how well we get on with the business of loving here and now. Raymond Moody and George Ritchie are both well aware of LDS teachings regarding the next life, and both have lectured before Mormon gatherings. Furthermore, despite his insistence that religion is not a factor in the near-death experience, Moody makes the following observation in The Light Beyond. There are many religions around the world that readily accept NDEs as the doorway to the spiritual world. The most prominent of the Western religions to do this is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as the Mormon Church. He then refers to the Journal of Discourses, observing that Mormons believe strongly in a life beyond, wherein the spirit has, quote, greatly enhanced capacities, unquote, including the ability to consider many different ideas simultaneously, move with lightning speed, see in many directions at once, communicate in a variety of ways, and be free from pain and illness. In this connection, he quotes a prominent church authority as follows: "We shall turn around and look upon it, the valley of death, and think when we have crossed it, why, this is the greatest advantage of my whole existence. For I have passed from a state of sorrow, grief, mourning, woe, misery, pain, anguish, and disappointment into a stage of existence where I can enjoy life to the fullest extent, as far as that can be done without the body." Moody also observes that Mormons undergo essentially the same experiences during their visits to the spirit world that other people do, and quotes a well-known example from the life of Jedediah Grant, as related by Heber C. Kimball. He said to me, "Brother Grant, I have been into the spirit world 2 nights in succession, and of all the dreads that ever came across me, the worst was to have to return to my body, though I had to do it." As Moody points out, Brother Grant's dread resulted from an encounter with his deceased wife and daughter during that period on the other side, and his reluctance to leave them for mortality. He saw his wife. She was the first person that came to him. He saw many that he knew, but he did not have a conversation with any but his wife Caroline. She came to him, and he said she looked beautiful and had their little child that had died on the plains in her arms, and said, "Mr. Grant, here is little Margaret. You know that the wolves ate her up, but it did not hurt her. Here she is all right." With all due respect, however, it is doubtful whether either Drs. Moody or Ritchie are fully aware of the remarkable prevalence of near-death experiences among members of the Mormon faith, or how detailed many of them are. Nor is it likely that any non-member, no matter how open-minded or well-informed, can fully appreciate or comprehend their ultimate ramifications in terms of that grand eternal program known as the plan of salvation. In reality, for that matter, none of us can, for it is eternal, unending, and here in mortality we all see through a glass darkly. As one who has written and lectured extensively over many years on the LDS view of immortality in any case, I can strongly affirm the kinds of experiences Drs. Moody and Ritchie have discussed and shared. I have rarely, if ever, spoken upon the life to come, in fact, without encountering at least one person afterward who has either had direct contact with the spirit world via the NDE or some other channel, or knows someone who has. Although I personally have never undergone an NDE, some of my close friends and relatives have been there. One fine lady I know, a relative through marriage, recently related her own experiences in the spirit world during a family gathering in my home. While suffering a serious illness, she passed into the spirit world and spent time, among other things, with a young daughter whom she had lost some years earlier. There, on the other side, she was also allowed to visit several of our temples. At present, she does not fully comprehend why, but has the strong impression that our temples are also spiritual centers relating to the NDE in some way. The accounts in my own case have been coming fairly steadily for a long time, so many now that some have been forgotten, or the details have become hazy. Others remain vivid. Several years ago, for example, a student in one of my writing classes at Weber State University submitted her own experiences in the spirit world to fulfill an assignment on the personal narrative. Living alone in a mobile home on the outskirts of town, she had at one time been asphyxiated during her slumbers because of a faulty heating system. In the morning, she was discovered apparently comatose and rushed to the hospital. There, fortunately, she was revived and has since led an active, productive life, excelling in many hobbies and teaching in a local high school. During the night of her mishap, however, her spirit had passed from her body into the next realm to visit rather lengthily with loved ones, including in particular her deceased parents. Like many others, she found herself amid beautiful pastoral surroundings, flower-filled meadows, and verdant woodlands. Her parents were dwelling in a pleasant cottage of the kind one might find in parts of rural England. She longed passionately to remain there with them forever. To her great dismay, however, she was lovingly informed that her time in mortality had not run its course. Shortly afterward, even as she reached out for a final longing embrace, she was drawn inexorably to her physical body in the hospital. Not long ago, while serving as president of the Ogden, Utah State Mission, I paid several visits in the company of a full-time elder from Salt Lake City to the home of a man who had spent much of his adult life in prison. Though formerly a tough and hardened felon, this man had a lot of charisma, was well-versed in the Bible, and now seemed to be reaching out to some extent for things spiritual. During one conversation, he informed us that he had nearly died a violent death 3 different times. On the final occasion, he had been stabbed by another prisoner, actually passed into the beyond for a brief visit with his grandmother, who was clad in a white gown and gold slippers. He then returned to his body, lying there on the prison floor in its own blood. Needless to say, his return was not a happy one, and at the time of our discussion he was living alone in a shabby one-room apartment, suffering from a degenerative hip disease that made walking painful and difficult. Nevertheless, his brief sojourn in the spirit world seemed to have given him a more positive outlook and greater desire to avoid past mistakes. Recently, my wife Sharon and I were visited by a convert to the church who had earlier served with me as a missionary in our state. Now a dedicated social worker, he had been wounded in Vietnam and nearly died there. More recently, during surgery for severe pulmonary edema, he had died and passed into the next realm. His visit was brief, and for some reason he could not see much, either in that world or the present. Only by a specific act of will, as he reflected upon his poor dear wife, a phrase that returned to him several times when he pondered her bereavement, could he look back and actually see her there, in his hospital room. Nearby him in the spirit world was a benign presence, though again he could not see who it was, merely sense the almost palpable emanations from a divine and radiant personality. Then he was hearing words from mortality, words of blessing. 2 doctors, both members of the LDS Church, had been summoned and were administering to him, or rather to his inert body there on the operating table. Now he could hear the blessing clearly, and again see into mortality, enough at least to view their backs and bowed heads as they performed the holy ordinance. Ere long he had returned to his body and was undergoing the violent trauma of electroshock resuscitation, feeling his body jerk and spasm, almost as though he might tear apart. He related this experience while visiting in our home, standing all the while, pacing about occasionally, for more than an hour. His entire deportment conveyed a humble, genuine desire to relate an extraordinary yet eminently real experience, but also frequent frustration in attempting to describe it. "But I can tell you this," he concluded, "all that happened to me over there, especially my right to return to this life, was somehow determined by that special being so close by on the other side." And as mentioned in my introduction, we have the Young Women's President from Idaho who related 5 such accounts, including her own death and return during delivery of her 7th child. Sometimes the spirit returns to its mortal body very briefly, to perform a particular act or complete some mission. Recently, following a talk I had delivered on immortality at a sacrament meeting, a member of that ward told me of his own near-death experience. He then referred to one of his relatives in Bountiful, Utah, who had died of cancer. Shortly afterward, however, apparently within the same hour, he returned to life for a few days, long enough to give his wife and children blessings. Then he passed on again into the spirit world for good. Some years ago, my father-in-law, Lewis J. Wallace, died of cancer, having waged a valiant battle and set an inspiring example of faith and courage for his loved ones and friends. His wife was away from his bedside at the time of his passing, attending to something in the basement. When she returned, he was gone, though not quite. Minutes later, his spirit re-entered his body for only a few moments. His eyes never opened, but a tear rolled from one of them, and as his wife bent over to embrace him, he murmured 3 of the most wonderful, magical words a person can ever hear. "I love you." Then he was gone. He had simply, in my opinion, by the sheer force of his remarkable will, returned for those brief moments to bid his beloved wife goodbye. Family members have sometimes suggested, partly in fond jest, but also with some conviction, that as a respected lawyer, he knew his full rights and took full advantage of them. A classic and impressive example in this category of temporary return is related by President Spencer W. Kimball in his excellent little booklet, Tragedy or Destiny. The account involves one of his uncles and occurred in November 1881. My uncle, David Patton Kimball, left his home in Arizona on a trip across the Salt River Desert. He fixed up his books, settled accounts, and told his wife of a premonition that he would not return. He was lost on the desert for 2 days and 3 nights, suffering untold agonies of thirst and pain. He passed into the spirit world and described later in a letter of January 8, 1882, to his sister what had happened there. He had seen his parents. "My father," he said, "told me I could remain there if I chose to do so, but I pleaded with him that I might stay with my family long enough to make them comfortable, to repent of my sins, and more fully prepare myself for the change. Had it not been for this, I never should have returned home, except as a corpse. Father finally told me I could remain 2 years and do all the good I could during that time, after which he would come for me. He also mentioned 4 others that he would come for as well." Unquote. 2 years to the day from that experience on the desert, he died easily and apparently without any pain. Shortly before he died, he looked up and called, "Father, Father." Within approximately a year of his death, the other 4 men named were also gone. At times, of course, spirits return through the veil with no attempt to re-enter their mortal bodies, in some cases long after their corpses have moldered away in the earth. Such was the case with Ella Jensen's Uncle Hans, who may have returned to mortality at least 3 times, as pointed out earlier, once to notify his mother of his passing, later to advise and comfort his brother there on the Snake River in Idaho, and finally during his visit to Ella herself when he summoned her to the other side. Moody's works, incidentally, do not involve experiences of this nature, perhaps because they are generally more difficult to verify. Such things, however, appear to occur frequently among people of all faiths, and again, as might be supposed, are very common among Mormons. Once, after speaking at a fireside in North Ogden on my favorite subject, yes, immortality, I was about to leave while members of the gathering were still enjoying some refreshments in the kitchen. The only person remaining in the living room where I had just spoken was a man I knew, seated beside the front door. "Looks as if I won't be adding to my accounts this time," I said. "Spoil my perfect record." "No, you won't," he replied and gave me a friendly grin. He then told me about the passing of his father a few years earlier, and said that his mother was not only saddened over the loss, but highly upset about having to arrange for the funeral. Above all, she was concerned about whom she would ask to speak. After a day or so, however, the problem was resolved. As she explained to her son, "Your father visited me during the night and said not to worry. He outlined the entire program and told me who he wanted as speakers." One of those speakers, incidentally, was the wife herself. One of my wife's close relatives was once visited several times during the night by her deceased sister-in-law. For some reason, though, the sister-in-law seemed unable to speak. She merely appeared by the bedside, and the relative in question became rather agitated, fearing that perhaps her time on earth was up. In the morning, though, she related what had happened to her husband, who phoned her later from his office to report that he knew the answer. The thought had just struck him with great force that his dead sister wanted to have her temple work performed. Sometime before her death, she had become unhappy over a misunderstanding with her ward bishop and left the church. By now, her brother felt certain she wanted to return. Her visit to his wife that previous night, in fact, had occurred exactly 1 year following her death, the waiting period required before one who has passed on can have such work performed. Her brother had not realized that fact until the awareness hit home that morning in his office and prompted him to check the date. A close acquaintance of mine, prominent both in church and community, once told me of a similar visit while he and his wife were nearing the end of their mission in Nigeria. Having arisen early in the morning to write in his journal, he was visited by the spirit of a neighbor who had died some years before. The neighbor earnestly requested that my friend visit his wife upon his return from Africa and urge her to have their temple work performed. His wife had now remarried, and he was clearly concerned that he might lose her to another man forever. My friend complied with the request, but when I last inquired, the wife had failed to take the desired action, an experience, perhaps, with an important lesson. An elderly man from my ward, now gone to the spirit world himself, once told my wife and me of a fascinating experience he and his brother had undergone regarding spiritual visitation. Years earlier, these two men had fallen into a heated disagreement over property rights. The dispute had become so bitter they had ceased speaking to each other, even though they lived only a short distance apart. Then, one night, something occurred that changed the situation dramatically. The man relating this story was visited by the spirit of his deceased father, who said, in effect, "I'm sick and tired of all this foolishness. If you two boys don't shape up and start treating each other right, I'll take both of you to the other side right now." The man in question took his father's warning to heart promptly, saddled up his horse, and headed off into the middle of the night for his brother's home. Partway there, he met his brother, coming top speed the opposite direction via horse and buggy. There in the middle of that dark night on a lonely country road, those two estranged brothers reined to a halt, leapt down, and embraced each other. Only then did they discover that their deceased father had visited each of them, only moments apart, and issued the same warning. A short time ago, I visited a woman, aged 70, in our ward while home teaching. Her husband, a member of my high priest's quorum, had died 2 weeks before, after much travail. Needless to say, she was feeling a profound loss. During our conversation, however, she mentioned almost casually that her husband had returned to visit and comfort her one night a week earlier. He really looked happy and peaceful, she said, and he also looked lots younger, about 30 years old. He was wearing a robe that, well, it wasn't exactly white. It was sort of cream-colored. Her husband, in turn, had been visited while on his hospital deathbed by his deceased mother. She was wearing a brightly flowered dress and had apparently come for him. Upon hearing such accounts, I must reiterate, I am invariably impressed by their simplicity and naturalness. Always those relating them are rational and modest, never given, as far as I can ascertain, to exaggeration or sensationalism. They merely relate what they experienced in simple, matter-of-fact fashion. For them, what occurred is so real, they never feel a need to argue the matter. It's simply